Welcome, students. Mr. Bockold here, and I am going to go over how to do your digital research presentation. It's simple. Essentially, all you're doing is taking your outline that you've already done and you're going to turn it into a Google presentation that you're going to share with the class. Now, at the end of this, you are going to ask specific questions for feedback, and then your peers are going to give you feedback. So when you go to write your essay, all the heavy lifting is going to be done. So the first part of this is going to kind of be the introduction. So you're going to start your presentation with why this topic interests you, why you care about it. That's kind of personal. Now, that part probably won't end up in your essay, but you're just going to tell your peers why you care about the topic. This next part, though, you're going to give context about it, and you're going to tell the students kind of the background information about the topic, what's the larger conversation, what are other people saying, what makes the topic relevant and current. So just give a little bit of background information about this. This would be a lot of the information that you would find in part of your introduction. Not necessarily the hook, but kind of that background, necessary background information between the hook and your thesis. All right, next part, your thesis. So your thesis, typically when you write, it can be longer and more complex, but when you give a Sorry, I don't want to be a boomer. When you give a Google presentation, you want to keep the words short and concise because too much up there is going to make it very difficult for your audience to follow. So you're going to articulate your thesis clearly and concisely, but you're going to want to cut the verbiage down really, really, really short. Now, in your actual essay, it might be longer and more complex, but in the visual presentation of this rhetorical context, keep it very short. And ultimately, your thesis is your topic, your position, and your reasons. Now, at the end of this, I am going to give you an example of how I would do this, and I'll show you that it needs to be a little bit shorter. All right, then you're going to reason number one. Essentially, you're just going to take your outline again and reason evidence number one. This part of your essay is now going to be brought into this Google presentation. Now, this is going to be the longest part of your presentation. So you might have to have 2 or 3 slides for each of these sections here. Don't worry about that. This is where you're going to bring in expert quotes. This is where you're going to bring in some of the research. This is where you're going to bring in charts or graphs or other things about this. This should be the longest part of your presentation. Then there's reason number 1 right there. Reason number 2 is going to be the next section. Reason number 3, you're basically just taking your essay and your outline and you're putting it in presentation format. That's really all you're going to do. Now, your conclusion, final analysis, big takeaways, and your call to action. Ultimately, this is supposed to be a persuasive paper, a persuasive presentation. You are going to persuade your audience to do something as a result of your ideas. So my next one, this is a reminder, like I do want to go over this. We didn't go over this very as often as we'd like. So I just want to go reiterate some strategies for this. Call to action. So remember this one right here. This is a student who won the editorial contest, and this student was limited science education, limiting ourselves. This student's call to action down at the bottom was right here. Schools must embrace and teach not only what is known, but what is unknown. Another student, is it actually smart to sit still? We went over this a few weeks ago. This is an awful Sorry, I've got the setup for the presentation, and I'm not going to get rid of it. Perhaps I should have just included this in a PowerPoint, but whatever. Sorry. Google presentation. This student asked, the call to action was to teachers down here at the bottom, incorporate movement into the classroom activities, stretching during class, and offering alternatives to sitting, as well as improving students' grade. So how are you going to, what do you want your audience to do differently and to think differently as a result of your essay and presentation? Finally, we have one, China, it's time to meet your daughters. This student had called the government to action. And here the student said the government should set up a program where families should submit their DNA, the approximate birth date of their child, and Providence, getting Chinese adoptees a real chance to find their parents that were forced to give them away. So now let's go back to this. We'll go present here. So when you are doing your conclusion, remember it's a call to action. You're persuading your audience to think differently, to do differently. How are you going to end? Okay, and then you're going to have your references in APA format. I've got a template for you to make this a lot easier, but you're going to include all of the references so your audience can find those. You'll quickly go over that. And now this is the important part, the questions. This is part of the drafting process. We're using this presentation as part of the drafting process. And you are going to tell your audience, your peers, specifically, hey, I'm concerned about this part of my paper. I feel like there's not enough development here. Are there better ways? Like if you were to come to class and have other people read your essay or view your presentation, you're going to be like, hey, I'm a little bit worried about this. What can I do better specifically in this part of my presentation or my essay before I do the final one? So that's exactly what, so whatever questions you have, if you were to bring this into a peer, and specifically, I'm worried about this part of my paper or presentation, help me out. This is where you are going to ask your peers directly for the parts that you're struggling with and where you want some input. So be very specific about your questions here because your peers can give you some great feedback about this. All right, so this next part, I am going to show you how I would do this. I have created an example and I'm going to show you what it's going to look like. Now, you'll notice that you've got one or two options with the graphics. Here's Bockelt's example. And you can either have this thing right here where I've got my face on there in the video. I kind of prefer that. It makes it a little bit more engaged and a little more personal. Or instead, you can do graphics. You can't do both. You don't have enough room on the screen to do both. It'll be visually way too much. So I have one example of me giving the instructions on how to do this. But for my example, I'm going to get rid of my face. I'm so sorry. And have augmented my presentation with pictures and graphs instead. So I'm now going to get rid of my face. Everyone say goodbye to Mr. Bockelt. And now here is my presentation, my example. Okay, so my topic is, here, let me give you the rhetorical context of this. I am a teacher in Fremont High School, and this is the research paper that I did for my master's program, and it was about Fremont High's reading scores. And the year that I did this for my master's program, the scores were atrocious. I'll get that to you. But this is interesting to me because I'm an English teacher and I care about Fremont High School's reading scores on the SAGE test. And it's my professional and ethical obligation to be aware of how I can help my students read better. So let me give you a little bit of the context. The year that I did this research paper for my master's, I looked at Fremont's 2015 English language arts scores on SAGE. Remember that awful test that we got rid of? One of the reasons we got rid of it is because the scores were awful. Anyway, so 10th graders this year for the SAGE test, only 54% were proficient in English language arts according to the SAGE test. Just a little over half of students were considered proficient in literacy. Wow. 11th graders, it was even less. It was 45%, according to the SAGE test, were considered proficient. That's a problem. We have got to solve it. So I am assuming now that my audience, I have been given time in faculty meeting and I've been given and my principal and the administration has given me authority to implement a program to help bring these scores up. And I am pitching an idea to the entire school. Okay, so here is my thesis. Notice how I don't have thesis actually on here. My thesis is this. And notice too that my thesis is very short, it's concise, and I'm actually going to say most of the thesis, and the text on my presentation is very minimal. Fremont High School needs to adopt a school-wide reading program that has the three following components. Number one, direct explicit comprehension instruction. Number two, intensive writing across the curriculum in all disciplines. And finally, extended time for literacy. This is reading and writing in all of our classes. Students need more opportunities to practice literacy. So now I'm going to address the first part of that, direct explicit reading comprehension. So the big question that I'm going to try to answer right now are basic reading comprehension strategies. You know, the strategies that are taught by English language arts teachers in the English classroom, are they enough to help students read content-specific tests? For example, the strategies that I teach in my English class, will they help students read a scientific test? Well, the answer to that is no, not at all. The research says that the strategies that we teach traditionally in English language arts will not carry over to all disciplines. They're not sufficient. So how are we going to fix this? All right, so the research says that we read texts very differently. Disciplinary texts or experts approached reading in very different ways consistent to the norms and expectations of their particular disciplines. Well, what does this mean? So what I've done with this right here, I have taken a screenshot from the ACT math test of a word problem. Now, we would not read this the way we would read The Great Gatsby. It's completely different. There are different strategies that are employed. Mathematicians, math teachers, highly value reading, rereading, and close reading. That's not the way you would approach The Great Gatsby. If we reread that and close read that every single time, oh man, it's going to take, The Great Gatsby is long enough. We don't need to do that even more. So we read this differently, and math teachers are going to be the best tutors to help their students understand how to read these particular types of questions. Let me give you another example. This is a page taken from a chemistry textbook. Once again, we're not going to approach this the same way we read Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's just completely different. So there are lots of different strategies, and students need to know these strategies and need to know how to tackle texts like these. So chemists value they visualize the concepts. When they read something, they picture it in their heads. They write down the formulas. When they get something down, they write it down, and they go back and forth. So they look at a diagram, they look at the charts, they go back to the text, and they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's not something that we do typically in in the traditional text that we read in the English classroom. So our students need to know the reading strategies on how to tackle these. And now, historical documents. Now, there's a lot of crossover, admittedly, between English language arts and history, but we tackle these texts, primary texts, with different assumptions than we would with literature. And one of those assumptions is that, we've got to pay attention to the context. What's the historical period? What's going on? What are these people saying? So one of the big things that historians pay attention to is the context of the society of that particular time period. One of the other assumptions, philosophical assumptions, is that these documents are only an interpretation of historical events, and they're not objective truth with a capital T. Instead, they're one person or one group's interpretation of historical events a long time ago. And that in order to get a bigger, fuller understanding of objective, capital T, truth, we need multiple perspectives in order to understand this. Once again, that's something completely different when we attack a novel. So, what are we going to do? What's the big idea of this? A successful literacy program that we need to adopt here at Fremont needs to equip students with explicitly taught reading comprehension strategies for a wide variety of texts. What does that mean? It's simply this. Math teachers need to teach their students how to read math texts. Science teachers need to teach their students how to read scientific texts. History teachers need to teach their students how to read historical text, and English language arts teachers need to teach their students strategies for comprehending general text and literary texts. Next part. Reason number 2 was intensive writing. I'm not going to go into that because this presentation is long enough. Number 3 was extended time for literacy. I'd have several slides on both of those, but we're running out of time. So let's just move into my conclusion. Again, my audience is a faculty, and I can already tell you that if I were to present this in a faculty meeting, I'm going to get a lot of people's feathers ruffled. The science and history teachers will be like, no, we don't have enough time to do this. So I'm going to say to them, it's not as hard as you think. You don't have to devote a lot of your class time to explicitly teaching reading strategies. You can do it occasionally throughout the weeks in small moments, and it won't take much time, but the dividends the investment will bring, their students are going to read their material and comprehend it better, and they will benefit from it. It will be worth it. And then furthermore, I would have the department heads with strategies on how to specifically do this for each department later on. And I'll say in our small departments, there will be further instruction on how to specifically do this in your disciplines. All right, there are my references, and I don't have any questions for my audience. It's you, because my presentation is kick freaking butt. Now, I will give you a template, students, so you can do this better. Can you do something else and do your own Google presentation or a Prezi or, heaven forbid, a PowerPoint? Yes, you can do that, but I've got a recommended template for you. All right, folks, this is Mr. Bockel. Keep reading, keep researching, keep presenting, keep learning.